Hello and welcome to Mekelle Foresight. This is Mekelle Benasse, producer and host of the show. Our guest today is a specialist in human cruelty, Professor Mukesh Kapila. That is how he once described himself. Mukesh Kapila is Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester, former UN and International Red Cross senior official. He served as Special Representative of the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity, and also served as Chair of Minority Rights Group International. He served as UN Humanitarian Chief in Sudan during the world's biggest humanitarian operation at the time. Professor Mukesh Kapila, welcome to Mekelle Foresight.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And let me first say, happy Christmas to all my Ethiopian and including Tigrayan friends all over the world for this holy season.
Thank you very much for your best wishes. During a TED Talk appearance, you shared a personal story of how many decades ago, in the aftermath of independence of India and Pakistan, your grandmom and her children, including your dad, at that time only a teenage boy, survived mass slaughter with train full other people just because of the courageous act of an ICRC worker. In what way has this story narrated to you by your grandmom shaped you as a person and your later work as a voice of reason against genocide?
Well, that story in that book refers to my grandmother who fled with her 10 children, including my teenage father, in 1947 during that partition of India into two countries, now Pakistan. So, and essentially, she survived on a grueling train journey, which was one of the most horrendous partition events, if you like. 1 million people were slaughtered within days. And she survived as a consequence of the courage shown by the accompanying Red Cross official who was protecting the train. So now in those days, there was no refugee convention because technically my grandmother and my father were refugees. And however, and there were no guns protecting, there were no peacekeeping, none of that sort of thing. So this young man, just with a Red Cross flag, and he came from a faraway country called Switzerland, in a sense, saved thousands of lives that were on that train. So I did not think much about this until many years later, when I found myself working in the International Red Cross in Geneva. And then I realized that the total secular nature of life, if you wish. And then I reflected retrospectively that there was a reason why my father must have been spared. And hence I came to be born. And hence, of course, my subsequent career in international humanitarianism. So in a sense, it had a profound effect in shaping the purpose of my existence on the planet, in a sense, motivating me to try and help others, learning from the example of those who had saved my own family.
Very good. In the same talk, you depicted the deep, dark pools of liquid pain you saw in Mary's eyes at the Freetown Hospital during holding a beautiful baby girl with both her arms amputated below the elbow, a horrendous, rampant act of the RUF. You waded through piles of hacked body parts in a church in Rwanda. You listened to a Srebrenica mother who had to go through blood-curdling scene of a mother's final goodbye to her teenage who had teenage boy who was snatched from her to be mass executed along with hundreds of others. You also narrated Aisha's gruesome story of gang rape in front of her family in Tawila in Sudan's northern Darfur, and how, while raping her, they insulted her as dirty black slave while shouting they were going to give her fine Arab babies. Although the specific people and events mentioned here are from the different times and place, the same heinous acts with the same intentions are being played out in Tigray as we speak. A Tigrayan mother, had to beg the genociders to at least spare one of her two young sons, in vain, as they were later driven off and executed along with many others. Over 120,000 girls and women of Tigray have been raped and gang raped, some in front of their family members. This is happening even as we speak in areas occupied by the Eritrean forces. What will stop this tide of evil, to borrow a phrase from the memoir you published in 2013 and was nominated for the best non-fiction book of the year?
Well, I think all I can say is, having become a student of human cruelty through my career, not out of choice or planning, you understand, obviously, but more out of circumstances and where fate took me. What I've learned is that human beings are capable of both extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty. And what we have seen in Tigray over the last couple of years is expressions of both. But as we're talking about cruelty here, I have been totally and utterly shocked at the level of violence that has been displayed in that civil war. And I was scratching my head thinking of finding a comparison and saying, when people say, is this worse than that? Is this more cruel than that conflict? And I've seen virtually every single conflict over the last 30 odd years around the world. I've personally witnessed these things. The only thing I could think of was that this particular war in Ethiopia ranks in order of cruelty alongside the civil war in Sri Lanka between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan authorities at that time, and maybe perhaps the Nigerian Biafra civil war earlier. I was too young, I wasn't involved in that war, but the stories from that war are highly cruel. So in short, I think from my study of cruelty, the Tigrayan war ranks extremely high, and certainly in terms of modern warfare, the most cruel of all conflicts in recent years. And in that sense, it's because this civil war, is in the most modern of ages, where we have the latest of technology, the latest of information and knowledge, even though it's difficult to get information out of Tigray. It means that the way in which the cruelty was conducted, for example, in Tigray, is in a sense much more sophisticated and modern, say, compared to the cruelty during the Rwanda genocide, which I also witnessed at first hand. So all I can say is that this is appalling, that I'm really shocked, and I wasn't prepared for such extreme cruelty to be manifested in a region, in a culture that is as ancient as that of Ethiopia.
So you will, I hope you will come to answering what will stop this,
I think
this tide of evil. But most importantly, why has the world not learned making never again an empty mantra?
Well, I think the world has learned, in the sense that we are no longer living in a world where we don't know what's going on around the world. So we are learning. So whenever anything happens in any corner of the world, we get to hear of it. So the old excuse that these things happened in darkness and in ignorance, and we only learned about it after they went, and then we became sorry and were shocked by what had happened. Even the worst of the Nazi Holocaust, we only learned after the concentration camps were liberated by the Allied forces. Now those days are gone. So, in a sense, we are very much learning and we are very much more enlightened about these things than we were in the past. But whether or not the lessons that are being derived from that learning, I think that's your question, why we are not acting on them is a very good question. And the answer is, in my opinion, it's not that we don't want to act, but that the tools available to the world that it can act in today's geopolitics are extremely limited. So I think there are good people all over the world, and they all know about this, and everybody wants something to be done about it. I mean, I don't think we are that thoughtless and uncaring. On the contrary, uh, but what to do is not so clear in the frameworks of the world, especially in relation to the fact that the world is very divided. You know, people, the countries of the world, the most powerful countries of the world are in different camps. We have a geopolitical divisions, which means that the legalized ability to act, to intervene, is blocked by another block of countries. When that happens, it's very difficult to intervene in a legal sense. And nowadays, countries are extremely reluctant to intervene in other countries, unless, of course, you know, you happen to have the war in Ukraine, where people are intervening through the provision of weaponry and so on. So I think it's strange. We live in a world of many capabilities and much knowledge and great power and great ability and capacity. And yet, ironically, we are actually less and less capable of acting. And that's an issue of both the way the world has paralyzed itself and also uh, our own lack of courage. I think we have become less courageous, geopolitically speaking, as time has moved on.
And when you know, weigh uh, geopolitical calculations and humanity, that's the mind-boggling part. You know, people being slaughtered, you know, at this level, to this extent, and you know, I understand the geopolitical and other, you know, calculations of national interest of countries, but you know, where has the concept of people sovereignty, the protection, the responsibility to protect gone? You know, the issue of collective security in terms of human security.
I think the responsibility to protect doctrine, which the UN adopted some years ago, and I was very much involved in those stages when I was in the British government at that time, as part of that doctrine development, was unfortunately flawed, because that doctrine of R2P relies on the consent of member states to intervene. Now, so if a government or governmental authority is committing crimes against humanity, then it's not going to give permission for the rest of the world to intervene. And if it was a sort of government that would give permission to others to come and help and intervene, then it's not the sort of government that would commit those crimes in the first place. So it was more of a symbolic moral doctrine and a kind of mirror to hold up to the world, but rather than any practical way of intervening. Unfortunately, what has happened is it provided the world with an alibi. It provided the world, especially the Security Council, with an excuse of invoking the doctrine, which has no teeth in it, and then giving the impression that it's kind of doing something. So it's more rhetorical. And behind the rhetoric, actually, bad people are free to carry on doing their evil deeds even more strongly, safe in the knowledge that they will never be interdicted. So that's the unfortunate consequence of that doctrine. I don't believe in it anymore.
Even the famine declaration policy of the UN agencies, as one of your fellow former humanitarian chief of the UN was saying, is broken. That system is broken because it places more weight on the consent of governments, while people die in millions. So why does the world, keep on coming up with such kind of policies that don't work?
Yes, you are right. The famine declaration system is broken, as also, by the way, is the public health emergency system. Because I know from my experience dealing with Ebola in West Africa, the WHO should have declared that a pandemic much earlier on. But countries in West Africa were very reluctant to allow that because it would affect their economy and their status and so on and so forth. And the case of famine, as you've seen in Ethiopia itself, the definition is so narrow that it's like it's the measurement of life. While people are arguing technical details about measuring life and death, people are dying. So in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in previous generations, also in the Horn of Africa, by the time you declare famine, it's kind of too late. People are already dead. You don't need anyone to tell you people are dying. You can see it in front of your faces. So the system is broken. Now, why do we tolerate it and why does it happen? Well, I think because we are a state-based system. The UN is a state-based club. It consists of member states, 190 odd member countries, and they have created this club called the United Nations. And within that framework, we have the sovereignty of individual nation states. And this was, in a sense, kind of understandable when these multilateral bodies were formed, because it was straight after the Second World War when nations had attacked each other. And so the idea of sovereignty of a state was central to the issue of stability in the world, especially to stop strong countries attacking weaker countries, big countries attacking smaller countries, right? So that was one reason. And also, soon after the Second World War, we entered the decolonization phase, and a lot of states were created who were preserving their sovereignty, and sovereignty was a very important part of national pride, which in the post-colonial period was an important part of nation building and identity. So for all those reasons, in the post-war period grew up an international order which is states-based. Now, what has happened is, as we know, states are good, states are bad, some are democratic, some are less democratic, some are more successful, some are less successful, some treat their people well, others treat them extremely badly. But the sacred principle of state sovereignty has kind of embedded in the world's DNA. But meanwhile, what has happened is the world has changed at a different level. People are more educated, people are more mobile, we are globalized, we have the internet, we have knowledge that crosses borders. You and I are talking to each other like this without any boundaries. And so the states-based order has not kept pace with the changes of society that have kind of emerged. And one thing that happens with change is that all changes are multiplicative and cumulative. So you only have to look at technology to know that when one technology comes, we make progress. When two comes, we don't make a double progress, we made 4 times the progress, because that's the way things change. So we are now at a phase where the evolution of a people-centered world and the traditional state-centered organization of the world order are competing against each other. So this is a world in transition. And I'm actually optimistic that in the end, either states won't survive, and they'll be smart enough to realize that not to survive, they will have to change. And meanwhile, people are not going to take things lying down as they once did, perhaps. Um, my grandmother ran away with her children at the partition. She had no choice, and that was the way it was. Maybe today's grandmothers will stay and fight and say, "No, I'm not running away." And this is what we're also seeing: the growth of resistance everywhere in the world, whereas people are being treated extremely badly by many regimes. There are so many examples, and Africa, unfortunately, is still at the leading edge of conflicts and cruelties in the world. But this is a necessary transition to go through to a different world order. I don't know when this new world order will emerge, other than to say that it is already emerging. And that's why many states are in retreat. They're realizing that, yes, they can be cruel to their people. Yes, they can dictate, like, for example, our dictatorship in Eritrea. But these are the last days of old world order. Unfortunately, people have to suffer still a great deal before a better order emerges. But we should, including in Ethiopia, look forward rather than look backward.
Thank you. And now I take you to the debate around whether what happened in Tigray is a genocide or not. First, I want to give you your perspective, and then where does this debate stand? I mean, in terms of, for instance, the US was trying to designate this, and now it seems it's, lying low key. So what is going on around this debate?
Well, I think, firstly, my professional opinion, based on having been a close observer, I should say, in situations of declared genocides, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Darfur, whether it's Srebrenica, whether it's Cambodia, is that the situation in Tigray satisfies all the technical criteria of a situation where genocide has been committed, right? So here I have to make a distinction. This is an important distinction, which was brought out by the International Criminal Court in its decision-making around Darfur. You can have a whole situation that is genocide, like, for example, the whole of the Nazi context, or the whole of the Rwandan context all those years ago was a genocide. Or you can have a situation where crimes against humanity have been committed in a particular theater, like in Tigray. Within that, there are acts of genocide that have taken place. So, in other words, you don't have to declare that the whole of Tigray is a genocidal situation, but acts of genocide have been committed inside Tigray, and the criteria of the Genocide Convention have been met. Now, if sufficient acts of genocide have been committed in Tigray, then of course they add up together to the whole situation being a genocide, if you follow what I am saying. So, in my opinion, the situation in Tigray is a genocide because the number of genocidal acts that have been committed, according to the Genocide Convention, are so many, so frequent, so generalized, so much under the command and control of the Ethiopian and the Eritrean authorities, along with their Amhara allies, that to me there is no doubt that that's what it is. Now, however, having said that, a declaration of genocide by some authority, meaning a government or a court, international or domestic, is a political act. So what's happening in the US is, I guess what it is they're titrating their thinking, their diplomacy, their politics, and saying, we're convinced it's a genocide. Otherwise, they wouldn't have embarked on the previous designation process that you mentioned. See, but we are not going to call it that in order to give a chance for some kind of restitution process to take place. Now, in my opinion, that is wrong, because when a crime against humanity, including genocide, has been committed, the first important thing to solve that problem is to recognize it. It's like when you go to the doctor and you have cancer. If the doctor suspects you have got cancer but pretends you don't have cancer, the doctor is not going to administer the right treatment. And today, cancer, by the way, is a survivable condition. I'm a physician by background. I use the analogy of cancer deliberately here because genocide is a survivable condition. Tigray will survive. Tigrayans will survive. They will not be eliminated. It's a survivable condition, just like cancer is a survivable condition nowadays, more and more. But it relies on the people who are wanting to help you survive to recognize for what it is. So powerful states, if they are not going to call it by its name, then they are handicapped, and we are handicapped. The good public is handicapped. Tigrayans are handicapped. Ethiopians are handicapped by not acknowledging and therefore not being able to do what is necessary in order to move on. And to give you another example, the way the Germans dealt with the Nazi Holocaust is a model, because or subsequently the way the Rwandans have dealt with their genocide is, see, terrible things happen. The Germans realized they'd done it, and a whole generation, 2-3 generations of Germans have grown up, saying what our country did was wrong. What our fathers and forefathers did was wrong. But we are good people now. We acknowledge, we remember, we will never forget, and we will build a better world. So it's very, very important for that reason that the correct definitions are used for the correct crimes against humanity that have obviously taken place, on which actually there can be no denial.
Yeah, so under these circumstances, do you see accountability happening for the genocide or the acts of genocide that happened in Tigray?
I think accountability will have to happen. Now, if your question is whether I'll see it, whether we'll see it this year, next 2-3 years, or indeed whether I will see it in my lifetime. I mean, I hope we'll see it in your lifetime. You're a younger man than me, but I cannot say. But if you look at history, accountability has to happen if there is to be a sustained or sustainable turning the corner and making peace. No conflict in the world has ever been followed by a sustained peace in situations where crimes against humanity have been committed without a process of accountability and justice. Now, the process of accountability and justice doesn't mean punitive measures. There are many, many models, and Africa, the continent, has pioneered many of the most interesting ways for accountability. You have to look at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission in relation to apartheid. That didn't mean locking up all the white people in South Africa in jails for many, many years. Or look at Rwanda, a country whose accountability process I have really admired, and I know a lot about that from extremely first-hand exposure. The first thing President Kagame did when he arrived was he abolished the death sentence. And when I asked him, because I remember meeting him at that time, I said, "Well, look at all this, million people killed, and you're abolishing the death sentence." And he said to me, "Well, enough people have died in our country. The last thing we want is more blood to be shed," right? So I thought that was enormous wisdom on the part of the Rwanda recovery system in terms of accountability, justice, acknowledgement, reconciliation. And so it meant that the gangs, the leaders of those crimes against humanity, obviously they had to face courts, they were put away, and I met many of them in jail when I went to Kigali afterwards. And some of them have been released over the years, and some of them have now in very senior positions because they have paid for their crimes and readjusted back to society. And they're absolutely the strongest champions and advocates against crimes against humanity, right? So, and there are other examples as well. We've had examples from Sierra Leone, for example. So, justice and accountability are absolutely essential for peace, reconciliation, recovery, and rebuilding a sustainable future. There is no shortcuts to this. There is not a single case in history where this has ever happened. And so it must be also in Ethiopia. Without that, Ethiopia, which has been in conflict itself for decades, with retaliatory conflicts, one side or the other, and one group or the other, and so on and so forth, they are not going. You are not going to find peace there unless you go through this process. Now, what form that justice and accountability takes place is negotiable. As long as the principle is followed, that justice should be fair, it should be impartial, it should be visible, and ideally it should be as close to the ground as possible. And it should involve the people, the victims, who need not just justice, they need to see justice being done. Not just justice, but justice to be seen to be done. So it's extremely important that international community and Ethiopia working together should find a form of justice and accountability, which it does the right thing and brings about healing whenever that happens. But you have to start off by acknowledging the crimes against humanity, including genocide, in the first place.
Thank you, Prof. If you have any final thoughts, that would be you're most welcome.
I think my thoughts are really my best wishes and prayers for all the peoples of Ethiopia, in all the different regions of Ethiopia, and indeed in the neighboring countries like Eritrea, which has such an important role in this, or Sudan, which a country where I've learned so much, which is hosting those refugees. One thing we know, and this is something Ethiopians need to think, you cannot have peace in one place and conflict in the neighborhood. It's a little bit like an infectious disease, and there again I rely on my medical knowledge. When think of it like an epidemic, like COVID. When you have a virus spreading, it's not going to know any boundaries. If you're going to stop the virus turning into a disease that kills lots of people, you're going to have to take measures that are going to protect wider populations, not just within your own little territory, whether it's Tigray, whether it's Ethiopia, it's the Horn of Africa as a whole. And therefore, the business of war and peace, which is, if you like an infectious disease, becomes a global responsibility. Many Ethiopian trolls who have been harassing me say, well, it's not your business. It's leave it to us. You see, well, it would be so. We would leave it to you if it were not for the fact that what is going on in Ethiopia affects neighboring countries in the Horn. What goes on in the Horn affects the rest of Africa. What happens in Africa affects the rest of the world. It affects me. So it is a responsibility that when these kinds of vicious conflicts happen, a country that is involved in that conflict, in this case, the states of Ethiopia and Eritrea, they lose their validity to keep this as an internal affair. It becomes a responsibility of the world. After all, crimes against humanity are crimes against all humanity everywhere. So in that sense, solidarity within Ethiopia, within the region of the Horn of Africa, within Africa, and with the rest of the world is extremely vital. The more international people are in their outlook, the more they're able to help nationalistic regions, and the more the people who live in those suffering communities find hope, because they know that they're not alone and they will not be left alone. And so it is here. We will not leave Ethiopia alone until it comes to its senses in whatever way. Either its government will come to its senses, or the people of Ethiopia from all the different communities and regions will have to bring about changes that will allow it to have sensible governance again.
Wow, thank you very much indeed, Professor, for your in-depth perspectives and analysis.
Thank you.
Well, we have come to the end of this interview. Thank you for watching.